So, welcome to our Budgets Basics Bootcamp. And tonight we're going to break down what happened a few weeks ago when Congress passed the continuing resolution to keep our government open until November 17th, um, and really demystify the complicated and somewhat behind the scenes process of how our budget, federal budget, military budget, is made. So at SFI, we believe that a budget is a statement of our values as a nation. So in addition to passing a budget on time, we really want a budget that values all of us. We want a budget that promotes our general welfare as a country. We want a budget that defends our democracy and our human rights. So tonight, there we go. What we're going to do, we're going to do a look back on September 30th, how we got there, who it impacts. We'll do a basic 101 of our federal budget, where our money comes from, where it goes, and how it happens. We're going to dig into the defense budget, identify decision makers in the budget process, and then talk about ways to take action. Just basic ways you can take action to urge your representatives to both vote for a speaker, hopefully in the next couple days, and also approve the budget by November 17th. So a couple quick things from our call tonight. For those of you who are new, SFI is a nonpartisan organization, which means we're free from political party affiliation or bias. It means we do not and will not support one party over another. We're not going to tell people not to vote for a candidate, and we're not going to tell people to vote for a candidate. So we're just going to ask that all attendees on this call remain nonpartisan during discussions. And we also have shared organizational values. So we believe in our democracy, our constitution, racial and gender equity. We believe in the equal rights of LGBT individuals and their families. And we consider political landscapes and dynamics in order to achieve our values. And so those folks that just joined us, if you just want to drop your name and where you're calling in from in the chat. We've got a group tonight. And so we just want to encourage everyone to keep themselves on mute unless speaking. We are recording tonight, so captions will be enabled for those that enable them on their ends. We're also going to share this recording and transcripts if you request it later today or tomorrow morning. And I just want to note, we're not congressional staff, so the folks you're going to be hearing from tonight, we're advocates. And this is a 90-minute training that's covering the basics of the federal budget. So I just want to say we do not know everything. And also we are trying to fit everything we do know into 90 minutes. So if it feels a little rushed at times, it's because we're trying to get as much into a really packed time frame because we know you all are busy. So our chat is going to be very active today. So I'm going to ask folks to either hold their questions. There'll be sections at the end of each of these agenda items where we can, discuss what was covered. But if you don't want to wait, definitely put your question in the chat. My colleague Erin is compiling all the chat questions. She's also going to be interacting with folks in the chat. So we'll compile them there, and then I'll compile them aloud for our speakers during the Q&A. And then if you don't have access to the chat, don't worry. We'll have time to take live questions in real time at the Q&A sessions. So I am going to turn it over to Alexis to basically just look back and see, what happened, what happened last month.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. I'm Alexis. I'm a Navy spouse and a government affairs specialist with SFI, and really excited to talk to you all tonight about how we got here. And so ideally, when you have a functioning Congress, this is what would happen. The federal budget funds all programs of the federal government: Social Security, military pay, military spending, TSA, the Coast Guard, and anything that you can think of that has the United States government on it or property of the United States government is paid for by the federal budget. And so about 4.5 million people work for the federal government, many of those being military spouses as well. And in the variety and the different variety of agencies that the federal government funds, that fiscal year runs from October 1st through September 30th. And so Congress has from October 1st until when they've passed a new budget to pass the following year's fiscal budget. And what happened this year was Congress cannot come to a decision. The House and the Senate, which are controlled by two separate parties, were not able to come to an agreement on the federal budget. And that is what led us to a government shutdown. What does a government shutdown look like? So from 2018 to 2019, for 35 days, 800,000 workers were impacted, including members of the Coast Guard. And we make that distinction when talking about the budget, because what many people do not know is that the Coast Guard budget actually falls under the Department of Homeland Security budget. It doesn't come from DoD. And just keep that nugget, because we'll get into that more a little bit later about all these different pots of money. But during that past shutdown, the Coast Guard wasn't paid because of it. So this most recent shutdown was caused by a small group of lawmakers. And this started in January of 2023 with the speaker's race. So we've all been seeing in the headlines in the news that Representative Kevin McCarthy is no longer the Speaker of the House. He was voted out. Who is the Speaker of the House? What does the Speaker of the House do? The Speaker of the House is your essentially top-ranking representative from the governing party most of the time. Sometimes you can have a Speaker of a House that comes from the minority, but that is not the norm. Typically, it is the party who is governing in the House in the majority, meaning they have more than 212 seats in the House, because the House is made up of 435 seats, and they vote for who the Speaker of the House is going to be. Speaker of the House has the responsibilities of essentially governing that body, deciding on legislative negotiations, as well as setting the agenda for what legislation can come to the floor and be voted on. And this small group of lawmakers decided that they care little about a shutdown. They care little about the US debt. And their focus is to cut diversity and inclusion programs within the military. And that is what this shutdown is all about. And so on, So on September 30th, we did not have a budget because, again, the small group of lawmakers are trying to essentially hold our government hostage to get what they want, not caring who is going to be affected by it. And at the last minute on September 30th, negotiations were made and a continuing resolution was passed by the House and the Senate, and then sent to President Biden's desk to be signed and effectively became law. A continuing resolution means we are going to use the same budget that we used for the previous fiscal year and continue using that for the next 45 days, or in other instances, however many days they've decided to come to an agreement, hypothetically come to an agreement and pass the budget so that it can be signed into law and our government can remain open. As of right now, the continuing resolution is in place. However, we do not have a speaker in the House. And what does that mean? That means that nothing can be done. No legislative business can be done. A budget cannot even be negotiated on. There's nothing that can be done until a speaker has been voted on and put in place. And that is a serious issue, not just for our budget, but for our government in general. And so I know that for a lot of us, the past few weeks have been extremely frustrating, trying to figure out what's going to happen, watching and waiting. But before we get into this bird's eye view and dive into all of this so that you all will be empowered to continue advocating for the issues that, are affected by a government shutdown for military families, I want to introduce Ellie Walker, who is a fellow with SFI and also a Coast Guard spouse, to talk about how the shutdown from 2018 to 2019 affected her family.
Thank you, Alexis. So yes, as Alexis said, I am an active duty Coast Guard spouse, and really I just want to bring awareness to what this means to families like mine, kind of on a personal level. As Alexis mentioned, during a government shutdown, missions are essential to national security. They keep running. So that means our service members, government employees, Coast Guard, they still have to keep showing up to work regardless of getting paid. And since Coast Guard falls under the Department of Homeland Security, and we are one of a critical branches of service, unless they find an agreement, we will once again go without pay. Unfortunately, as an active duty Coast Guard family, this is not the first shutdown we've experienced. In the shutdown of 2019, the pass down from Coast Guard leadership was to find odd jobs as a means of supplemental income. Dog walking, babysitting, ride sharing, those were actual suggestions that was passed down to all our Coastie families. My husband actually, he picked up a side hustle as an Uber driver during that time, but as we all know, that hardly pays your grocery bills, mortgages, car payments, when you're still required to work a full-time job. And at that time, airport runs in Jacksonville, Florida, weren't exactly hitting the jackpot. So we also had USAA and other military nonprofits that were offering low interest loans, but institutions like USAA, the requirements of 800 credit scores, hard credit checks, it was outrageous. And oftentimes higher enlisted families like ours fall somewhere between making too much and you're not quite broke enough. So we were in completely uncharted territory and literally left to just either sink or swim. So many of our friends and even our family members had no idea that the Coast Guard was part of the affected entities that were going without pay. There was an overwhelming number of spouses on other military pages that were just completely taken aback that an entire branch of our military would be going without pay. And so then when it came time for us to pay our mortgage, we were just desperately seeking guidance, a letterhead, like something to make it make sense to our lender that we wouldn't have the money to pay our mortgage. And it was to no fault of us. But fast forward to now, 2023, we are in a considerably different and more challenging season of life. We now have, 3 kids in tow, pets. We recently PCS, acquired a new mortgage, new car payments, and we're actually down to 1 income now. So, and because of our recent move, this is the first time we have been transferred somewhere distant from another military installation, and the accompanying military resources that go along with being near a base. Last time it was a 35-day shutdown in 2019. We were fortunate enough to have the Jacksonville USO. They had food and grocery distribution. We had the local VFWs for food and groceries and various supplies, and they really supported our Coast Guard families. But here, our next closest Coast Guard unit is Savannah. By the way, I sit right outside of Atlanta. And so we are several hours from any other military installation that could potentially offer these support services to us now. So what are we supposed to do? At this present moment, to be completely honest, we feel kind of stuck. We're frustrated, we're anxious, we're all of the emotions. This time around, my 2 older kids are much more aware of current events, and they just really don't understand, much like the rest of us. Aren't they supposed to pay you? You're in the military. They can't just not pay you. I mean, these are legitimate questions from a 7 and a 9-year-old trying to dig through their piggy banks because they just want to help. So yeah, we're here again. We're at an impasse in our government, but also different this time is that I have been fortunate enough to have a soapbox to stand on for other Coastie families like mine. And I've been able to advocate along with SFI and other spouses to question members of Congress. Like, why are we here again? SFI has helped amplify my voice, both at tables and to politicians in DC, social media platforms, about really the urgency of our government to be able to implement safeguards for our military families in times like this so that we can avoid these seasons of uncertainty and continue to be able to provide for ourselves and our families. So I really just encourage everyone here in attendance that whether you have a direct relationship with the military or you're an avid supporter of our, servicemen and women, your voice does matter. There's a famous saying that goes, all advocacy is at its core is an exercise in empathy. And so if you're here tonight, then, or you're listening in, you're the advocates. You can write, you can call, you can make a video, whatever your communication strength is, use it. Like, reach out to your representative, let them know that they can't continue to play with our livelihoods and then still expect us and our service members and their families to continue to show up for them and this country in the way that they need and expect us to. You have to pay your military. So that's my story. I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca. She's going to get into the really nitty gritty hard stuff. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Sally. Thank you so much. And I just really appreciate you being vulnerable and taking risk and like sharing that story with all of us. And it just, for me, a reminder that our future isn't written, right? Like, we get to write it. And I think in this moment, we're all so uniquely positioned, and I would say collectively positioned, to write our futures for ourselves. And like anything else, right, we know our experience is the best. And these are the stories that folks who make decisions really need to hear, and lawmakers need to hear, because they have to have a face to some policy that they're pushing or preventing to push. So I just really appreciate you being on the call with us tonight. So I'm going to try to do a lot in a little amount of time. And I really am encouraging everyone to lean into that chat option, because we're going to do a high level bird's eye view of the federal budget and try to break down a process that's evolved over the last 240 plus years into 30 minutes. So buckle up. Here we go. So big picture, under the US Constitution, all of this starts. So the Constitution gives Congress the ability to exercise what's called the power of the purse. So this power is expressed through several different provisions. For example, the power to collect taxes and the power to borrow and appropriate funds. What the Constitution doesn't do is it doesn't specify the process for how the budget is created. So the process we're going to go over is something that's really evolved, and we're going to do our best to simplify something that's a really complex process. So again, not going to get into everything, but the hope here is that you'll be able to walk away with a better understanding of how the general process is at least supposed to work, and who the decision makers are along the way to be a more effective advocate. So first, there we go. Okay. Where does our money come from? So I want everyone just to take a few seconds. And if you have a piece of paper, scrap piece of paper, or even just make a mental picture on thinking about where we get our money. So if you draw a circle, picture that circle being the 2022 annual budget. This includes $4.9 trillion. So on your own, draw how many dollars of that 4.9 million come from the following sources. So source one is individual income tax, pretty self-explanatory. Second is payroll tax. So these are taxes that are paid both by workers who are employed and also the employers. And then the third bucket is corporate income tax. So these are income taxes on profits made by corporations. So I'm gonna give everybody like a couple seconds. It could be a percentage, it could be an amount. Okay. So I don't know if this is accurate reflecting what you would put, but this is where the money laid out in 2022. So out of the 2022 federal revenue, the federal government brought in 2.6 trillion from individual tax returns, income taxes, 1.5 trillion from payroll taxes, 425 billion from corporate income tax, and then an additional 356 billion from other taxes. And just like the other taxes, makes up like customs duty taxes. I think there's an excise tax. There's a bunch of other just smaller percentages of tax revenue. So just like quick show of hands, did people guess that individual income tax was the biggest percentage, payroll tax the medium, and then corporate income tax the lower? I don't know. Is this close? Yes, thumbs up. No, not really. Kind of down. I was wrong. Okay. No, I was wrong. Okay. That's fine. That's why we're doing this. Came to the right training. So the point of this slide really is like above and beyond the government is resourced by people like us, right? People that either pay taxes on our income or pay our own taxes through payroll through our employer, above and beyond, right? So it's regular people like us that fund the government. Okay, so where does the money go? Mandatory spending. So there are three different categories: mandatory spending, discretionary spending, and net interest. And these categories are important because they delineate how different buckets of money can be spent and the decisions that lawmakers make, the timing, the decisions the lawmakers make on those buckets of spending. So they're not named for how important or needed they are, but the name really refers to the relationship between the law that authorizes the program that's funded and the law that determines the program spending. And so like the best way to really think about it is that mandatory spending are portions of money that just are typically ongoing. Legislation exists, and in order to change that funding category, a lawmaker would have to amend the legislation, whereas discretionary funding is a funding pot that gets reevaluated, reset, worked in the weeds every single year on an annual basis. So to break down mandatory spending, again, programs required by law. So this includes Social Security, this includes Medicaid, this includes some of the bigger buckets of social healthcare programs. In addition, mandatory spending also includes a portion for Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, formerly known as food stamps. There's also some farm price support programs. And it's just really important to remember that these are usually authorized for either multi-year periods or permanently. So it's just harder to get in the weeds and change that spending program. However, some services that are associated with mandatory programs might be diminished if there's any type of discretionary component to the funding. For example, during the 1996 shutdown and the 2013 shutdown. So when we're looking at Social Security, the Social Security checks continue to go out, but staff that handled new enrollments, other services such as changing addresses, handling requests for cards, they were all furloughed. And then there's another piece in here in mandatory spending that includes like roughly like subsidies, right? So like agricultural subsidies, things that again are usually multi-year. So moving on to discretionary spending. So by contrast, discretionary spending are programs and activities that are set up every year on an annual basis. So this usually accounts for all of like about 1/3 of all funding. This is where the majority of our defense spending is, which the first time I heard this, it blew my mind. Completely blew my mind. So in addition to the Department of Defense, this portion includes all operating budgets for civilian agencies, medical care for veterans. So the majority of our VA is funded through discretionary funding, not all, but the majority. Grant programs, for example, education, medical, scientific research, and some low-income housing assistance programs. And then the other piece here is we've got that net interest, that's interest on the debt. So this is usually less than 10% of all funding. And I also just want to name that in 2022, our government spent more than was brought in on revenue. So that refers to the deficit in the federal debt. And so We go into a 201, this is all going to be covered in 201 because especially after this year, I think a lot of people have a lot of questions about the federal debt. Just to understand the debt, we first have to get a handle on the entire process. Okay, so we're going to move on to how this breaks down in categories. So you see the mandatory spending, the discretionary spending, and the net interest. You see how mandatory spending breaks down into Medicare, Medicaid are the two biggest programs compared to discretionary programs or funding split into non-defense and defense, which is typically how it's categorized under the Congressional Office of the Budget. And then just to break it down more, and we're going to send these slides out to everybody after this workshop. You see the mandatory spending from last year. Medicare by far was the largest. You see Medicaid, and then you kind of see how all of that was broken down into Social Security, income security, student loan programs, federal civilian and military retirement benefits. So again, this is where all the benefits programs come for service members, civilians. And then there are certain veterans programs that are funded through multi-operational funding. But again, as I said, the majority is funded through discretionary. So, okay. So we're going to move on to the discretionary budget now. So last year it was 1.7 trillion. And again, this is the category that's negotiated every year. These categories here are all of the categories that are used by the Congressional Office of the Budget, which is referred to as sometimes the COB. So when we look at these categories, when we're looking at healthcare, that's where the majority of the VA spending operating expenses are. So, these are expenses that are relating to, over 7 million veteran patients. Healthcare also encompasses funding by the CDC and the NIH. When we look at transportation, this is what funds our national highway system, air traffic control, and aviation. If you all remember this last round a few weeks ago when they talked about potentially transportation and air, civilian air being impacted, that's why, right? Because transportation's in the discretionary budget. They also sometimes include, as Ellie noted earlier, the Coast Guard and parts of DHS. Transportation security. So then we also have National Resources Environment. So that's our parks, Environmental Protection Agency. Then we look at international affairs, right? USAID, diplomacy, Peace Corps, what funds our global HIV and AIDS initiative, any contributions to international agencies such as the WHO. Community block development grants are under community development. And then education's a very large component, right? So this funds all federal programming related to K through 12 vocational education, any primary aid to school districts in areas that have low income students or students with disabilities in civilian schools. And then Pell Grants, which is how I went to college, right? Help about 7 million students from low and moderate income households afford college. And then, we just have a lot of other programs that are encompassed in the discretionary budget. And I want to break down the defense piece, because if we remember, defense was non-defense and defense. So in defense, there are 4 categories: defense operations and maintenance, defense procurement, defense military personnel, and defense research and development. And so for folks that are really interested and concerned about base housing, base facilities, anything related to an installation, that typically falls under defense operations and maintenance. Whereas clearly the paycheck, the personnel, the healthcare for non-retirees, that would fall under military and defense personnel. And then R&D and procurement typically have to either do, research and development or procuring weapons and technology. So I'm assuming that our poll is not working, which is fine. It is.
I put the question in the chat for everyone to answer.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I think Zoom got overwhelmed by the information and the poll just gave up because.
So Rebecca's poll is, how would you all, I'm sorry, I sent the poll to Rebecca, not our chat. So how would you all prioritize $1.7 trillion?
Okay. Great. I love how people are putting answers in. Well, we're going to see how this shakes out. And I don't want this to sway people to stop responding, because we want to see how y'all respond. So this is where the money went. So out of the 1.7 trillion, the majority went to health. So VA predominantly, and other health benefits. Second, in the non-defense spending, was education, training, employment. Third is certain veterans benefits. These are like, how do I say it? Everything from the cemetery system, the veteran cemetery system's funded in this. So just think about, just very broadly, how our nation funds auxiliary programs for veterans and their families. Transportation, income security, international affairs. We also had funding, 68 billion went to the Department of Justice. And so that's both the DOJ, but also law enforcement. Community regional development, natural resources and environment, general science, space and technology, and then other. And so other, it says in the slide, but I'll read for folks that can't necessarily see it. This is pretty much outlays for general government, agriculture, and there's also some additional administrative costs for Medicare and Social Security in that don't get covered in the mandatory spending. And so then when we look to the defense budget, which is 751 trillion, that breaks down majority going to operations and maintenance. And so I believe that is for both CONUS and OCONUS bases, but I'm not totally sure. I just want to flag that. I believe that's all of our bases. Military personnel, then procurement, then research, development, test and evaluation, and then 48 billion goes to other. Okay, so we're going to run into the process. So, where we are at for process. So there's two big components of how the budget works. The discretionary budget works from the point of conception to the point of the president signing it. And the first big process, part of the process, is the actual budget process. And then the second is called the appropriations process. And so this all starts with the president's proposed spending levels for the next fiscal year. So, you know, we start always a year prior, right? Funding for the federal government begins begins with the president's budget and ends with the president signing it. But just the caveat is the way that I'm about to describe this almost never happens, which is going to be a fun theme for tonight. So to start, each federal agency works with the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the White House, and the budget requests really describe what leaders at each government agency think they need to run things for the current year. So Office of Management and Budget then works with these agencies to combine these budget into what's referred to as the president's budget request, or the PBR. And then the president's request would also include the president's preferred tax policies and how the government is going to bring in money. But this, just again, is just any budgetary request or budgetary proposal is typically just a suggestion. So Congress would then write its own appropriations bills, which may have little in common with the president's request. So step two, this then goes over to Congress. So it goes down to the second line of this graph. So then what happens in both chambers, right, simultaneously, is that the House and the Senate budget committees would draft and mark up a budget resolution in both chambers. And then this budget resolution provides a blueprint that would then guide financial or fiscal decision-making in Congress. This would be passed in both the House and the Senate, and then establishes just the top line levels for the budget, setting targets for revenues, upper level spending, upper level limits for spending. And it's not a law. It doesn't like actually give the Treasury the right to cut checks, but it really just sets the term for debate. So thinking about back to your priorities and our priorities, this would be the time to start talking about the priorities, right? So it's less getting into the nitty gritty of what things cost, but more what we value and how the budget would then resource the values that we have as constituents. So in a theoretical world, this budget resolution would set the revenue, spending, and targets, and then literally they call it crosswalking. They would crosswalk it over to what are called the committees of jurisdiction, which are the House and the Senate Appropriations Committee. So the note here is that this rarely happens. So this is just like, we can talk about the theory of it happening and how it's supposed to lay out, but in most actuality, Congress seldom completes budget resolutions. They seldom set top lines, and we're going to go through the timeline of when they're supposed to do that in a second. So what typically happens is when they don't do this, the spending limits, revenue floor, are really set around the prior budget resolution from the previous year, and then automatically continue for the remaining years of that budget resolution. So we're going to move now on to the appropriations process. So an appropriations bill is legislation that allows federal funds to move from the U.S. Treasury to specific federal government departments, agencies, programs. So this is the money that basically funds everybody. Payroll, operations, personnel, activities, grant programs, right? The House and the Senate both have appropriations committees, and these committees are responsible for determining the precise levels of budget authority or levels of discretionary spending for all programs in that discretionary pot that we were talking about earlier. So this is when that all gets worked out. This is all the defense spending. This is the operating budgets of civilian agencies. This is the VA. These are those low-income education grants or programs. This is the research stuff. All this gets worked out there. And each subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee in each chamber, which there are 12, are responsible for creating an appropriations bill. So they cover different areas of the federal government. For example, there is a subcommittee for defense, which would be military spending. There's another subcommittee for energy and water. They're mirrored in both chambers. They each conduct hearings and meet with constituents, meet with each other, meet with agencies, where they get additional information on how they should fund government agencies and programs. And so then, based on all of this information, the chair of each subcommittee writes the first draft of the subcommittee appropriations bill. And if there is a budget process at the beginning of the year, they would follow the top line of that congressional budget bill. Then the appropriations bill would they'd all get a chance to vote on it in the subcommittee. Once they pass the subcommittee, each of the 12 bills would go to the full appropriations committee, and then the larger committee can then change it even more, and then they send it to the full House or Senate for a final vote. So caveat time. Recent years, none of this has happened. So there really hasn't been 12 appropriation bills. And what's happened recently is they've just really kind of put all of the discretionary funding and spending into one big appropriations bill, which is called an omnibus package. That bill covers all 12 appropriations bills, and it's usually used when Congress and the president can't agree on the passage of those 12 individual spending bills, because again, the president's power really comes at the end, where he would have to veto it or pass it. So after the committee votes, appropriations committee votes, then this full bill or 12 bills would go to the House of Representatives and the Senate in each chamber to vote on it. And then after they vote on it, they send the bills in both chambers to what's called a conference committee. That conference committee meets, iron out any differences between the House and the Senate versions. This committee is typically made up of members that are picked by leadership in both chambers. And they work together in theory, to reconcile their differences in their respective versions of the bill. Both chambers must pass identical versions at any legislation before it can be signed into law. And so after the conference committee produces a single reconciled version of the bill, then it goes back to the House and back to the Senate. But this time, both bills are identical. they would then pass both chambers, and then the bill finally goes, the budget finally goes to the president for the signature. And again, I just want to name that in all of this process, the president's power over the budget comes largely from this ability to veto the appropriations bill passed by Congress. And so this is really just a negotiation game at this point, right? So if Congress doesn't believe that the president is going to pass certain things, that's where we see this pullback, this back and forth to try to work out in Congress before it gets to the president's desk, right? Because the president has such power in that moment. And so when the budget process is not complete by August 1st, Congress can do two things. They can allow the federal government to shut down, or they can pass a continuing resolution, which Alexis mentioned and talked about earlier, which happened a few weeks ago, to basically continue where government would continue to receive funding until the full budget is in place. Okay, so just to summarize, President submits a budget bill. That typically happens by February 15th to Congress. In theory, the House and Senate would pass budget resolutions. These are their top line budget bills. This would typically happen or should happen by April 15th, but again, they might not do that. Then the Appropriations Committee starts getting their act together. They would put together 12 detailed appropriations bills representing those 12 separate areas of government. This process can start on May 15th, and it typically takes the whole spring and summer. And then in theory, the House and Senate would vote then on these bills or a full package and iron out their differences by October 1st. And the president would sign each of these appropriations bills by October 1st. So that is the process in your Cliff Note version. One more part, military budget. Then we're gonna open it up for Q&A. Okay, Alexis, you are on.
Okay, everyone, I'm going to try and keep your energy up as much as possible. Fun fact, my husband served 5 years on an aircraft carrier on his last tour. So I am very passionate about defense spending and the defense budget. So what is the NDAA? The NDAA stands for National Defense Authorization Act. And I know there was a question within our chat about the separate pots of money and separating those. And so those 12 appropriations bills that we talked about does include the NDAA. So each appropriations bill, like Rebecca said, handles those agencies and other line items that have to be funded. So the National Defense Authorization Act shapes policy and is a messaging tool that depicts what Congress values. So essentially, the NDAA says this is what we are going to spend money on for our military. This is what matters to us in our military. And Erin is dropping some links in the chat to this year's NDAA executive summary for the House and Senate respectively, as well as the bill text itself. I always say that for a layperson or someone who is new to learning about the NDAA or even budgets, and even for myself, I like to read executive summaries of bills before diving into the bill language. If you've ever read Shakespeare, you know why. So this is what the NDAA does. It authorizes appropriations and establishes policy for DoD, as well as nuclear weapons programs at the Department of Energy. Fun fact, our aircraft carriers in the Navy are powered by nuclear energy. Defense intelligence programs and other defense activities of the federal government. So this also includes the Defense Health Agency, which oversees our MTFs, our military treatment facilities, as well as a host of other things. The Defense Department is one of the only remaining agencies that gets such a yearly authorization. The NDAA determines how money can be spent and what it will be spent on. The bill itself does not provide the actual budget authority, which occurs in the annual appropriations bill cycles, but it authorizes programs, projects, and policies to be carried out with the congressionally appropriated funds. So, that was a mouthful. Let me break it down a little bit. The NDAA is this is how we'll spend the money. This does not say you can spend the money, but once you have it, once we say you can spend it, it can only be spent on these things. And I know there are not secret activities, but there are classified activities within our military that, you know, we can't put a line item and say what they'll be for. So there is that, you know, kind of small little piece of the DoD pie, the NDAA pie, that goes for those activities. So those are definitely not forgotten. Okay, can we hit the next slide, Rebecca? Okay, so the NDAA authorizes funding levels and authorizes programs like we talked about. Where does the NDAA process start? It starts in the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. And so one thing to know about the House and the Senate is that they have the same committees. The names may differ ever so slightly, but they have the same committees that will review the same bills if those bills fall under the purview of that committee. So example, military spending is going to go to the House Armed Services Committee. It versus, you know, spending on agriculture will go to the Agricultural Committee, and so on. And so in February of each year, both the HASC and the SASC, that's what we call them for short, House Armed Services, Senate Armed Services, will hold hearings regarding the budget. And this is the opportunity for advocates like ourselves, if we're invited or by a representative or a senator, to bring testimony before these committees to say, please fund this issue. This is what matters to us. Typically, sometime between April and June, the respective armed services committees release their proposed bills, referred to as the chairman's markup, which they then review, amend, and pass through their different subcommittees. And so just to break it down before we get into the slide picture, when you have your House Armed Services Committee or your Senate Armed Services Committee, what do those subcommittees look like? Those subcommittees look like a personnel subcommittee. So we are going to take a closer look at bills that affect decisions regarding personnel, such as DEI initiatives. This subcommittee, so readiness, is going to look at how much money are we going to appropriate for a new aircraft carrier? How much money are we going to appropriate for a new F-35 jet? Those type of things would fall under a readiness subcommittee. And so once they have marked up their bills in public, the HASC, the House Armed Services Committee, will typically be more public about their markup and what they want to put in, what they do not want to put in. The Senate is a little bit more closed doors. And so each committee and subcommittee decides on their rules for that year, for that Congress. And so that is what allows the SASC committee to be a little bit more quiet about the markup. I'm just going to stop for about 10 seconds to catch my breath, as well as let anyone who might have any questions or be forming any questions in their head pop those into the chat. Okay, so we're going to go back a little bit. In March, the executive branch releases their version of the NDAA, releases what they want to see in the NDAA. So that's why, you know, the White House has its own budget office, things like that, because the White House doesn't get to jump over Congress and say, this is what the budget is going to be, as Rebecca taught us earlier, right? They have to say, Congress, this is what I would like to see. March, HASC and SASC hold their hearings, they draft their bills. June, they release the bills for subcommittee markup and amendment, meeting. Do these subcommittees that we just talked about want to add something, remove something, make a comment about something? Are they going to amend or change the bill? Once this has been done, typically July, and I promise Kate and Rebecca did not forget to put a date on the SASC side. The question mark is there because we don't really know. There are still some things that are a little bit cloak and dagger in Congress. So in July, I'm sorry, I'm tripping over my words. In July, the bill is submitted for the full floor consideration, debated, and passed on the House side. And sometime between July and the end of the fiscal year, SASC will do the same thing. It's debated, it's passed, and then it is then reconciled. So the leaders of each chamber, so typically the speaker and the president of the Senate majority leader, as well as Senate minority leader, and all of the other names that make up the congressional leadership. So you have your minority whip, your majority whip. That's more of a 201 class to break down the leadership positions within Congress that representatives take on. But they will go and talk about it and say, okay, this is what we're willing to take out if you keep this, and vice versa. And this is what should have happened about a month ago. Well, a few months back. This is what should have happened for the NDAA. And the reason I mentioned this is what should have happened is because within our military community regarding the shutdown, there were some questions and misconceptions and misinformation about whether or not we would receive paychecks the way we did in 2018 to 2019, minus the Coast Guard. So that in 2018 to 2019, active duty who fall under the DoD pot of money were paid because the NDAA had already been passed. This year, nothing has passed, and that is why this is even more critical for our communities, right? And so right now, what should be happening is that these differences are reconciled in conference, and once that has happened, the final bill, which is identical at that point, then goes back to their respective chambers to be passed and sent to the president's desk. And so I know we just went through a whole lot with that process, and it does seem very simple, but when you get into the nitty-gritty of how much funding is the CDC at 29 Palms going to receive, and how much money is the CDC at Naval Station Norfolk going to receive, that is where things start to get complicated. Okay, where are we going to place the Space Force headquarters? That is also part of NDAA policy. Those things are what holds up these conversations. And the reason we brought up diversity, equity, and inclusion is because we know that in the past 3 years, the Biden administration has made strides towards making the military a more DEI-friendly place. And we have a group of lawmakers who want to see that progress reversed. And that is what brings us to this situation today, hence this training to empower you all. And so that is how the NDAA is done. Once the NDAA is passed, we have a military budget, and that goes hand in hand with the federal budget that Rebecca mentioned. And so I will stop to give everybody a chance to open questions. I do see one question that just popped up. DEI is diversity, equity, and inclusion.
So we just covered a lot, and I really appreciate Alexis taking us through the just mystery of the NDA, which I feel like folks have been on the Hill and working on the Hill for years don't understand. So I just I just really appreciate you taking us through that, Alexis.
I'll ask a question just to throw something out there. Do y'all have, kind of opinions or, an understanding of, why at this point, since we've been here multiple times, they have not put safeguards in place so that, at least our military, I don't want to say like you don't get paid, but you do, but our military, who's our issue of national security, if we don't have them, why they don't have a safeguard to be like, in the event that this happens, we'll take care of you, like by this time, is that a priority? Do you see that ever happening? What does that look like?
Yeah. So I can jump in just with like a context, if that's cool, unless you want to take it, Alexis.
I don't know, you go ahead and I'll add if, but I expect you to hit all the points.
So big picture, so since 1976, it's my understanding that there's been about 20 funding gaps, which basically means that, Congress didn't pass the full budget by October 1. And out of those 20 gaps, there's been 4 true shutdowns, which means that operations were impacted for more than just one day. So I think from the position that like I'm looking at is the continuing resolution is the stopgap. And so what happened a few weeks ago and in 1819 are not supposed to happen. Like it's one of those situations that's not supposed to happen because they have the back, like the fallback on the continuing resolution. I think what adds an additional level of just for me personally is the fact that in addition to the level of difficulty Congress has been having getting these things across the finish line, we also have this outlying situation of no Speaker of the House, which we're going to talk about in a second, which has never happened in the history of our Congress. And so I think it's really fair to say that within the history of the United States, these are also new things. And so we talk a lot at SFI about, we are in a moment and there are hundreds of years and thousands of years that came before us in this moment. And there were also hundreds of years fighting for equity, equality, our families, our communities. And we are just in a long line of people who have done that. So that, and also this is new, right? It is a new moment in history. I don't know if I answer your question, Ellie, but that's my take. A lot of this never happened before. Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just add to that. You all saw how much information we digested tonight, and that's just a small piece of the puzzle from a bird's eye view. So imagine being a new representative or a new senator and hitting the ground. Everything they're doing, they are learning from the beginning. And I say that for freshmen, sophomore, junior. Even when you've been around for years, I've seen where representatives are like, is this a thing? Do you know about this? And so I'm going to also put that there, that's why things like this happen, because our government is meant to function a certain way. We clearly don't have legislation that says in the event of a shutdown, military will continue to get paid. And that's what leads to this, as well as a lot of chest thumping, power grabbing, as we're seeing right now. That is what creates these issues too.
And yeah, exactly what you're saying, and provides opportunities for us to then advocate for those things, right? And so I think that's part of this, right? The reason these things don't exist is because no one has pushed and built the power and the collective action in order to get them, and that's one of the reasons that we're here, right? I see there's a couple more questions. Yeah, Erin, do you want to go?
Sorry, Jen had asked, are they ever going to think about making military pay in the personnel category into its own bubble so that they can keep paying actual people and fight over everything else without it affecting families?
So this would be moving military pay into the mandatory spending category and making it multi-year. Great question. I don't have the answer to that question. I don't know if you do, Alexis.
I imagine that there is a Congressional Research Service report that breaks down how to move things from mandatory spending to discretionary spending. But what I've seen in the past is that anything that is NDAA there has to be separate legislation to remove it. Or even make changes to it. So for example, another organization that I'm aware of that's an MSO tried to advocate for having the TRICARE age for dependents for children extended to 24, the same way that health insurance through the exchange that civilians purchase is available. And there needed to be individual legislation that was kind of like an addendum to the NDAA to make those changes. So I think it would be the same way if we were to move things around from discretionary to mandatory. Again, I'm not 100% sure, but I think that that would likely be the situation.
Any other additional last? Let's do one. We do one more before moving on. That's okay if we don't have any more. I'm going to move us on, and if there are additional questions, we can loop back around before the end. So we're almost there. I promise. We're almost there. So, okay. My favorite part. Who are the people in charge? My favorite part. So we're just going to lay out the top key decision makers in this process. There are hundreds of decision makers here, but I think as advocates, we only have so much time. We only have so much energy, and so for us, it's good to just know, who are the players and being able to direct our resources to the players that have the most amount of power. So in the current Congress, there are, two different chambers. We talked about these roles previously, but just to kind of spill it out, we've got the House Speaker, the Majority Leader, and the Minority Leader. So there's been a lot of conversation about the House Speaker in the last few weeks since Kevin McCarthy has been voted out. The role of the House Speaker is to give members permission to speak on the House floor. The House Speaker counts, declares all votes, has a lot of power appointing members to committees. So when we were talking about the Budget Committee, the Appropriations Committee, the House Armed Service Committee, the Speaker is really key and central in seeing who goes where and who has what power in what way. The Speaker also has power to send bills to committees and bring bills to the floor, right? So that's, things won't get voted on unless the Speaker is so enabled to actually move the thing to the vote. So right now we have no Speaker. Every day we watch, we see the budget again starts in the House, and so not having a Speaker at this moment in time actually restricts the House from doing any governing until they find a Speaker. And so that's why all of the news coverage on that issue is so important, and particularly important to us and our families. So in addition to the House Speaker, we have the Majority Leader, who also has a large say in shaping the chamber's overall agenda, determining when, whether, how, and order legislation is taken up. Typically works very hand in hand with the Speaker of the House. Current Majority Leader is Representative Steve Scalise from Louisiana. Also his name has been thrown out as one of the key frontrunners in the Speaker's race. And then in addition, in House leadership, we have the Minority Leader, who's currently Hakeem Jeffries from New York. And the Minority Leader is basically the leader of the minority party, a party that does not have the current majority in the chamber. So this responsibility includes speaking for the party, its policies, protecting the minority party's rights. If folks followed the Speaker's race in January, I think folks can probably remember that the minority party voted as a block, and Representative Jeffries was always the person speaking for that block, right? And so that's just typical of a role that the Minority Leader would play. So then moving to the Senate, very similar in the case of leadership, we have the Majority Leader and the Minority Leader. In the Senate, Minority Leader is currently Senator Chuck Schumer from New York, Minority Leader Senator Mitch McConnell from Kentucky. And so, on the Senate side, the positions of these two leaders really set the tone. So instead of, in addition to doing a lot of the logistical and committee appointments and power moving that they do, their agenda really sets the tone of the Senate. And so typically, they are the ones that are going to be speaking to press. They are the ones that are going to be speaking on behalf of the Senate. They are the ones that people are going to be going to, right? And so given who is in charge, who is in that role, not just, do our nation see those positions as the tone of the current Congress, whether it be the House or the Senate, but they also really set a precedent and a tone for the international community, which is why it's so vital, I think, for us, particularly in our situations, to have leaders in place that are actively reflecting the tone that we want to put out for the international community, because again, we are such a player in the international community. So just other real quick going through, I'm not going to go through all of this. It is a lot. So you will have this on your own, but these are some of the committees. So we talked about the House Appropriations Committee and the Senate Appropriations Committee. They've got chairs. The current chair in the House is Kay Granger from Texas. We have the 12 appropriations subcommittees. There they all are. You can see how they all sort out regarding parts of the government. We see it on the same kind of side, same kind of way in the Senate. Senate Appropriations Chair Patty Murray. You know, the role of the chair is really they're just responsible for most of you know, most of what happens in committee, right? Setting agendas, moving legislation, making sure the committee's doing its job, right? So these folks have a lot of power. And you can see that on the subcommittee side, all of those subcommittees mirror the subcommittees and appropriations on the House. So then we have Budget Committee. And again, I didn't list all of the members, right? There are a lot of members of all these committees, but setting the top line, we've got on the House side, the chair there, Jody Arrington from Texas. And then on the Senate budget side, Sheldon Whitehouse. And I definitely was tired when I make this. It is ranking member, not ranking member. So that is my fault. And really what the ranking member is, when you see that title, it's the leader of the minority party in that committee. And I think we have one more and then we are done. Armed Services Committee. So when Alexis was giving the overview of the NDA, this is a legislative committee. This is where that starts. So on the House side, it is House Armed Services, or HASC. Senate Armed Services, or SASC. Again, we have the chair, Mike Rogers, Alabama, ranking member, leader there, and from the minority, Adam Smith, and then on the Senate, Chair Jack Reed from Rhode Island, and ranking member Roger Wicker from Mississippi. So I think we have reached the conclusion of tonight. I just want to say before we leave and break into, okay, what can we do? I think we have 35 days before we hit the deadline for the continuing resolution. So there are a few things that that folks can do. Oops, I'm sorry about that, guys. Here we go. That folks can do between now and then. And so just to kind of give everyone a quick pep talk, in the 48 hours before, leading up to the October 1st vote, there were, in our network and in our organization, 392 letters that were sent from members just of the SFI military community that went to key lawmakers leading up to that vote. And so, these were the letters, we on CNN, on different news, we had members submitting letters to the editor, all with just the key messaging that, we need to vote, they need to vote to keep our federal government open, pay our military, pay our federal workers, and keep crucial social services nets running, right? And so we know, and we saw this a lot with what happened even in the Tommy Tuberville situation, right? Even when a small group of us organize and collectively act, it has a massive impact. And so we're really trying to rein that power now from now until November 17th and exercise it, not just to keep the government open, but also to keep the government funded in a way that aligns with our values. We've got time to fight still to get a speaker, to get them to pass the budget, and really fund the things that our community cares about and needs. And so this can look like all of the stuff we talked about earlier in the training that folks wanted to prioritize, right? Getting more tools in the diplomacy toolbox for our foreign policy and international affairs folks. Getting more resources that make sure that our CDCs and our off-base schools have equitable education, that our communities are free from toxic exposures, right? Make sure that our communities have resources that ensure that all of our communities and all of our people feel safe, no matter where they live, how much money they make, the color of their skin, who they love, or who they worship, right? And so that's really why we're here. it's not just to get stuff for us, right? It's to get stuff for all of us so that we all have what we need and things that we deserve. So from now, for the next 35 days up until November 17th, we're going to keep pressure up. And so here are a few things that you can do. Last screen share of the night. Okay, so first thing, that is not the right slide. First thing, send a letter. Okay, so we've updated our letter to Congress. We have a template you can use to get a letter out the door tonight. You can do it tomorrow. You can tell a friend. We really want to keep those letters going in. So Erin's going to share that in the chat. Second thing, we are collecting quick video testimonies of folks who need this budget passed for very real reasons, for financial security reasons, for reasons regarding our commitments to this country. And so we are collecting video testimony of why you care about this issue. There is a link in the chat to either sign up to do that or sign up if you're interested in submitting something similar to a letter to the editor in a local paper. We have a team that is willing to support you to do both those things. So all you need to do is get your name on that thing, on that form, and we will contact you directly and we'll figure out a good time to set up a chat in order to support you to do that. The third is register to vote. So we can all vote now if you're voting absentee. The election is November and Congress is up next year. So Erin is sending another link that gives everyone resources to either register, check your registration status, figure out where your residency is if you've just moved, or if you haven't voted in a couple years, and give you the correct information so you know you're following all of the absentee protocol that you need to follow in order to get your vote in on time. And with that, I think we are going to conclude for tonight. As always, there are lots of ways to get involved in SFI. So in addition to tonight's training, we really encourage you to hop on our next member call, join a caucus, join a leadership or campaign team. We have links on how to do that in the chat, and check your email box because we will be sending a recording of this, the slideshow, and all of the resources that we listed today out to y'all probably tomorrow or Monday if I am tired. And with that, any last questions before we close? Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for your advocacy, and we'll definitely stay in touch, and have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, no matter where you are. So bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.